All right, our restoration project manager. Take it away.
All right, cool. Yeah, thanks y'all for coming out on this beautiful Thursday morning. I'm really excited to talk a little bit about saguaros and what we have going on right now. So here, let me share my screen. All right, let's see. All right. Doo-doo. Okay, can y'all see that? Did that work?
That
Okay,
works great.
awesome. Perfect. Yeah, so let's get right into it. I always like to give just like a little brief introduction on myself, just because I don't really have the most outward facing role within Tucson Audubon comparatively to our education staff. Yeah, I'm the restoration project manager for Tucson Audubon. I have my bachelor's in science in fisheries and wildlife from Michigan. I'm originally from Michigan, so I'm really a little bit scared of this summer that's coming up. And after I graduated, I worked a couple different seasonal field jobs with birds and other wildlife. I did a lot of songbird banding, seabird monitoring in Maine. I've also worked with gray vireos, golden-cheeked warblers, did a little bit of work with invasive plant management, and that has led me to this role here. And in my free time, I really like birding and going out and trying to identify all sorts of critters in the desert ecosystem and learning about different things. And when I'm inside, I really like crafting. So just for fun. Um, so I've already gone over a little bit of an introduction on me and kind of what we're going to talk about. But for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to focus on giving just a brief overview on saguaro ecology, and then we'll delve a little bit further into some details about the saguaro project specifically. So I wanted to first go over the origins of the saguaro Latin name because it kind of has this interesting history behind it. In 1848, it was given its first scientific name, Ceres giganteus, by a guy who was going around the Sonoran Desert, just kind of recording all of the plant species that he could find. And then almost 50 years later, it was given a different scientific name. And that kind of has some interesting history behind it. So in 1902, this guy right here, Andrew Carnegie, he was a big funder of the Desert Lab. And in 1902, he came to visit the Desert Lab. And all the scientists that were there were like, oh, so excited. They really wanted to impress him. So they gave him a big tour of all the work that they were doing there. And they brought him to a saguaro and they said, hey, look at the saguaro, like such an impressive plant. We named it after you. And he thought that was kind of weird. He was like, how did this plant go undetected for so long that that it didn't have a scientific name until now? That's weird. And they said, no, we renamed it after you. And he wasn't super impressed by that. He thought it was pretty weird that they were kind of altering the scientific process just to honor him. But to this day, it's still Carnegie gigantea. So that's kind of the history behind its current Latin name. So now I've explained the first half of the Latin name. The second half, I probably don't really need to too much because saguaros are truly giants of the desert. They are among the tallest cacti with the greatest mass, and the tallest one ever recorded was 78 feet. And interestingly, as you can see in this picture, it had no arms, which is kind of interesting for saguaros because the reason saguaros have arms are so that they can increase the reproductive potential, right? The flowers and the fruits come out of the tips of the arms, and so that really helps them in kind of creating more seeds and increasing that potential. But interestingly, this one did not, which maybe that's why it got to be so big. It put all of its resources right into just growing straight up. Unfortunately, you can't see this saguaro anymore. It was toppled by winds in 1986. But if you're trying to think, if you're trying to imagine, what does 78 feet look like? Just because personally, I know that it's kind of hard for me to envision big measurements like that. So 78 feet is also the height of the White House. It's also the height of the Christmas tree at Rockefeller Center, and the height of 4 giraffes that are stacked on top of each other, just for fun. So getting back into kind of more serious saguaro topics, saguaros do kind of mimic the boundaries of the Sonoran Desert a little bit. So this pale yellow polygon on this map right here, that represents the boundaries of the Sonoran Desert. And then these black dots represent saguaros. So you can see that it's pretty closely matching that boundary. Now, saguaros don't go much farther north than that boundary because it gets a little bit too cold up there. Saguaros are not really adapted to frost. And where you do see them along their most northern range, they're typically on southern facing slopes where they're able to get the sun's rays earliest in the morning and they're able to warm up a little more quickly. In those areas, you'll also find that they have denser spines at their growing tips. And that is one way that they can kind of protect them from frost a little bit more. Along their western range, they don't really go farther west than this because it gets a little bit too hot and a little too dry, and they really require a lot of precipitation. And along their western range, they definitely thin out quite a bit. So you don't see them as much out there. And talking a little bit about water and how saguaros store water. I'm sure you all have seen a mature saguaro, especially here in Tucson. They're pretty abundant. And they have this ridge-like formation around them. And that's specifically so that they can absorb water. And then once that they use that water, they can kind of contract like an accordion. So it can kind of, change its shape so that it can store more water within it. But with younger saguaros, you can see that they don't really have that accordion-like structure built yet. So we're seeing that it takes quite a long time for them to develop that, almost basically over a year for them to start developing that ridge-like formation. And so really early in their development, they really require a lot of water because they don't have that water storage capacity that the adults do. And so, like I said, they require a lot of moisture to start off with, and they're also pretty particular with when they need that moisture. So specifically, they need a lot of moisture in the summer during the monsoon season, and then they need a really good wet winter after that. And then after that, they still need a really good monsoon season. So, it really takes a long time for them to develop that ridge-like structure, so they really need a lot of precipitation. Another thing to mention is that the seeds don't stay stored in a seed bank. So it's kind of like a one and done deal. If they don't establish that year, they're not gonna come back the next year. So it's really critical for them to receive this amount of precipitation in these specific patterns. And it's really important to mention too, that this specific pattern hasn't happened in 24 years. And so we're not seeing that new generations of saguaros are establishing. All right. And let's talk a little bit about why saguaros are important. Why do we even care about saguaros besides them being wonderful and charismatic plants to see around us? Saguaros are what's known as a keystone species. For those of you who aren't familiar with that term, a keystone species is basically an organism within an environment that supports a lot of other wildlife and a lot of other taxa within that ecosystem. So another really good example of a keystone species would be like a beaver, right? They create these dams, and those dams store water that completely kind of change that ecosystem so that lots of other animals can benefit off of it. Saguaros are kind of the same way, and I'm going to get into kind of all the functions that they provide for animals in the desert. The first one would be fruit. This is a really important resource for wildlife because they occur during the hottest and driest times of year where it's kind of really desolate conditions. So lots of animals will depend on the fruit during this time because the fruit has lots of sugars and nutrients and all that good stuff that things will want when it's really hot and dry out. So lots of animals will eat the fruit. Birds like this white-winged dove, coyotes, all sorts of kind of different critters will depend on this. Also, the flowers are really important. So they provide nectar and pollen for bees, bats, birds, all that good stuff. The tissue is also eaten by rodents, jackrabbits. I know this isn't a picture of a saguaro, but I thought this was applicable. They'll even eat the small saguaros, which I'll kind of get into later as well. And saguaros also provide nesting habitat for lots of species, birds and bats alike. One species that uses the saguaro is this caracara. They nest in the crooks of the saguaro. I'm sure some of you have seen some big nests in saguaros, and those are really exciting to see. The saguaro also provides nesting habitat in the form of its cavities. And saguaro cavities are specifically created by woodpeckers, right? Those are the only ones that are specifically going to saguaros and excavating these cavities. And one of the really interesting things about woodpeckers is they create a new nest every year, which means their old nest are left available for other species to use later. And so species like secondary cavity nesters, these are organisms that don't create the cavity themselves, but rely on these cavities that are created by these woodpeckers. So American kestrels will use these old cavities. Elf owls will use these cavities. Lucy's warbler, tons of different species are really reliant on these saguaro cavities created by woodpeckers. And another important thing to mention is that even after a saguaro dies, that's still providing function to the ecosystem. Tons of insect and arachnid species have been documented using saguaros. So really from all stages of life, at the seedling stage, small rodents will eat those. And then as the saguaro matures and grows flowers, those are dependent on by wildlife. The fruit is dependent on wildlife, and then even a dead saguaro is still dependent on by wildlife. So now let's get a little bit into the saguaro project now that I've given a little overview on saguaros in general. I'm sure many of you have heard about our planting efforts, where we're planting 14,000 saguaros, but that only actually makes up one prong of this entire project. We have 3 prongs of this project that are all targeting protecting saguaros in different ways and improving the environment in different ways. So the first one I wanted to talk about is our nest box project. So for this aspect, we're really trying to replicate saguaro function, right? So we are basically creating nest boxes that mimic saguaros so that we're replacing some of that function in the ecosystem. And we're specifically focusing on one species that we've worked with in the past, so it just really made a lot of sense for us to kind of focus on them, and that is the desert purple martin. We've done a little bit of monitoring with desert purple martins, and they're a really interesting species, or actually they're subspecies. They are one of 3 purple martin subspecies. So you can see over here, this is a really common subspecies in the east, the Subis subspecies. That is the subspecies that nests pretty much only in man-made nest boxes at this point. And then we have the Arboricola subspecies to the west. They nest in tree cavities, also created by woodpeckers. And then down here to the south, we have our desert purple martin subspecies, the Hesperia subspecies. And you can see that only really comes into Arizona just a little bit. And they are the only subspecies of purple martin that nest in saguaros. They're kind of a little bit different from the other subspecies in that way. And like the American kestrel and elf owl and Lucy's warbler, they are secondary cavity nesters, so they're not the ones that are doing the work to make their house. They're just moving in. Like I said, they only nest in saguaros and cardones, and it can take a really long time for the saguaros to reach the size where a purple martin will nest in it. It'll take 80 to 100 years for that to come back. So it's really important for us to be kind of creating these nest boxes so that in the time that we're planting these saguaros, the function of the saguaro nesting is still being taken care of. Yep, and it's a little baby. And we recently had a purple martin nest box competition where everyone could submit their designs for what they think a desert purple martin nest box should look like, because this has never been done before. There's never been a project that specifically looked at making nest boxes for desert purple martins specifically. So this is kind of a really exciting time to be a part of this project, to be a part of this like novel implementation method that we're doing. And we're really hopeful about it since I'm sure many of you have heard about our Lucy's warbler nest boxes. Those hadn't been done before, and they ended up being really successful. And so we're really hopeful that we'll be able to do it again with desert purple martins. So here are just a couple of the designs that we're testing out from that competition. We have a bunch more. These are just kind of what would fit in the photo. But it's really interesting to kind of see all the different designs that people have come up with. And we're currently in the process of testing out some of these designs. We're putting them out in the ecosystem, and we're putting little devices inside of them that will measure the temperature so that we can tell, is it really mimicking the temperature of a real saguaro? You know, because saguaros, you know, they're pretty thick. They got some insulation to them. So we want to make sure that, you know, the nighttime temperatures, the daytime temperatures are all mimicking the natural saguaro function. And in the end, we're going to be installing 750 of these nest boxes, whatever design really works for us. Now, the second aspect of this project has to do with protecting saguaros. So many of you might have heard about bufflegrass in Arizona. If you haven't, bufflegrass is a really big problem within Arizona because it's an invasive grass and it's also highly flammable. Unlike many of our native plants here in Arizona that are not adapted to fire. Bufflegrass will burn very hot, and it will carry that fire as long as there are bufflegrass patches, which can be very extensive. This is a really big problem for saguaros because saguaros aren't adapted to fire. If a fire comes through, that's pretty much the end of the saguaro. That's it. Whereas the bufflegrass, they're like, yeah, fire, we're gonna come right back after that. So it can turn these really diverse, exciting native ecosystems into these bufflegrass monocultures very quickly. So these bufflegrass has fueled two of our bigger fires in Arizona, the bushfire, which burned almost 200,000 acres, and the Bighorn Fire, which burned 119,000 acres. And in these fires, it's likely that hundreds of thousands of saguaros died off in that process. So we're really trying to kind of get rid of those risks. So we'll be doing 1,000 acres of invasive plant treatment so that we can protect our saguaros, basically. Oh, yep. Let's forget that I have extra pictures in here. All right, and then that brings us to our third aspect of this project, the aspect that that has been widely advertised of this project, where we're going to actually be planting saguaros in the ecosystem. And we're going to be pretty particular over where we're going to plant these. So we're specifically prioritizing those areas that have been burned. So we're replacing those populations that have been lost. And then we're trying to do that during times where it's green, right? We don't want to plant when it's super dry and crispy and there aren't many other things for herbivores to eat. We want to be planting when it's green and when hopefully things will eat things besides our little saguaros. So we definitely want to be very careful about that. We're getting these little baby saguaros from nurseries, and we will be planting 14,000 of them. And so this is what they look like right now. I have a couple right here. So these guys are probably about a couple years old. And this is kind of the majority of the size that we're trying to plant. We also have a couple that are a little bit older than that, so about this size. But we're definitely trying to plant the smaller ones because we want to plant as many as we can. So we want to be as cost effective as we can about that as well. And we're also planting these specifically under other vegetation called nurse trees. And the nurse trees provide a couple different functions for the saguaro. So it'll protect the saguaro from really hot conditions, really cold conditions. It might hide the saguaro from predators that might want to eat it, right? That might be a little bit better than planting it way out in the open somewhere where it's like super visible. And the saguaro can also actually draw up moisture that the nurse tree is storing in its roots as well. So it can kind of even, you know, be benefiting from the nurse tree itself as well. So just wanted to give just a summary of what we've gone over. So we are, for this project, we're going to be, well, we're choosing a nest box specifically for desert purple martins. Then we're going to be implementing 750 of those boxes. And then we're also going to be treating 1,000 acres of invasive species and planting 14,000 saguaros. So really kind of looking at how we can benefit saguaros the best using these 3 different methods. If you're interested in helping out with this project, there's a couple ways you can do that. The first way would be to volunteer to help plant saguaros. 14,000 saguaros is a lot of saguaros for me to just plant on my own. So I definitely appreciate any help that people are willing to provide. We currently don't have any planting dates scheduled because we are waiting until we get a little bit more rain, because right now it's a little bit hot and a little bit crispy. So we want to wait until we have some rain so that we can do the best job we can to give these guys the best chance that they have. If you're interested in donating to this project specifically, you can also go to tucsonaudubon.org/saguaro. We have a couple links there, a couple different fun ways that you can donate. And also my last thing that I'll mention is about providing nursery recommendations. I'm currently in the process of looking for nurseries that are selling very small saguaros. We currently are working with someone who's growing out 10,000 of them for us, but they're not going to be ready until next year. So we're really looking for specifically small saguaros, which is hard to find. Many nurseries kind of only sell saguaros that are like, 3 feet, 5 feet tall, ready to go in someone's yard. And not many people are selling these like little baby guys. I don't think there's a huge market for them, which is making it really hard for me to find. So if you have any recommendations, that would be really appreciated. We've been working with Box Nursery on Thornydale quite a bit, but if you have any other recommendations, I would definitely take them. I've called probably about like 50 nurseries so far. So yeah, any help would be really appreciated. And thank you to our funding sources, including the Wildlife Conservation Society, Tonto National Forest, Coronado National Forest, our Tucson Audubon members, and all of you for being here today. And yeah, And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me, or I guess we can go over questions now as well. But if you think of anything else, you can also write down my email, and I'm happy to answer anything.
Thanks so much, Aya. And yes, I will be sending out just a follow-up email with a couple of links, like the donate link and volunteer links. And I can also share Aya's contact information as well.
Yeah.
We do have a couple of questions for you, Aya, if you are ready.
Yes, I'm ready.
All right. So Laura is asking, how can you easily identify bufflegrass when it is a young plant? Because that's a difficult thing to do. And then the second part to that question is, are there other invasive grass species that we should identify and pull if we can? And if so, what are they and how do you identify them?
Oh, this is an excellent question. I'm going to try to answer as best I can. We have a lot of people on staff that are specifically invasive species minded, but I'll try to give the best answer I can. So bufflegrass, when it's kind of more mature, it has those purplish seed heads that will turn more tan as it ages. Another good way of identifying it is if you look at the intersection of the stem and the leaf, there should be some little hairs that poke out, and I've heard that's another really good way of identifying them. I'm pretty sure that you can identify a young plant using that, but yeah. Sorry, there's another piece to that question. The grasses. Another species of invasive grass that I've seen around Tucson a whole lot is called Bermuda grass. It has one stem that has kind of multiple kind of long seed heads coming off of it. I think there are like 4 kind of branches that branch off the top of it. And I see that all around Tucson. We've been doing a lot of work cleaning up stormwater basins, and it's all over the place in there and all over in people's yards. Also seen it like recommended by landscapers online for like lawns because, you know, it's invasive, it grows very well, it stays green. Would not recommend planting it. Would definitely recommend taking it out if you see it. So I know that there are others, but I think those are the main ones that I've seen.
Okay, and I will try and add some links to that follow-up email about bufflegrass, Laura, as well, and about some grasses, some materials that our restoration program manager, Tony, has, or I'm sorry, invasive plant program manager, Tony, has put together. So I'll make sure to share that stuff as well. All right, so we have another question from Mary. In what specific areas will saguaros be planted and how were they selected?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're specifically going to be planting in Tonto National Forest and in Coronado National Forest. Those are kind of our 2 big planting locations. And we're specifically targeting those areas that have been burned by wildfires. So the Bighorn Fire and the Bush Fire. So we're specifically going into those areas and replacing those saguaros in those areas. And we're also planting in some areas around Tucson. We've already planted around 350 at our Mason Center. And we're also planning on planting at Santa Cruz River Park as well. But Coronado and Tonto are kind of like our main ones. Good question.
Thank you. Thanks for the question, Mary. Tracy is wondering if we could quickly review some human threats to saguaros. So what the human threats are. And Tracy, you know, I'm not sure which proposed highway you're discussing. Oh, yes, I do. Yes, I do. So if you know anything about that, comment. And if not, then Tracy, I can also refer you to our advocacy director to answer more of the highway part of your question.
Thank you.
That is an excellent question. Human threats to saguaro. I think that just with human development, right? Anytime that an ecosystem is being cleared for development and there are saguaros there, saguaros are at risk in those areas. I know that they do have some certain protections that are placed on them. Whether those are always followed, you know, we're not really sure. Besides that, I haven't heard anything on the highway, so I can't speak on that too much, but I definitely will be looking into that later because I think that's good for me to know. I'm trying to think of anything else. I mean, I would say, yeah, human development's got to be one of the big ones for them. Yeah. Thank you for that question.
Thanks, Tracy. All right. And just a comment for everyone, if you're curious, Cheyenne had a really good suggestion, which is to participate in any invasive grass pulling events. I know the Desert Museum hosts some. We've co-hosted some with them. Other organizations will host them. It is a really good way to learn because you're physically pulling the grasses. And if you do that enough, you'll really get a good look and you'll really get to know. So that's a good suggestion, Cheyenne. And then Michael is asking, what causes the damage to the base of the plant? So I'm assuming, are you asking the bases of saguaros, Michael? Michael, you can go ahead and unmute yourself if you are able. Okay, so I'm assuming Michael is asking some of the damage that you might see, you know, if you walk by a saguaro and you'll see some of that kind of stuff. And I'll clarify in the chat.
Yeah, that's a really good question. One of the things that comes to mind for me that I recently learned is that saguaros, the spines grow up at the top of the saguaro and then kind of migrate downwards as it ages. So maybe some of that is just kind of like seeing it age. Like I'm sure the spines at the base of the saguaro probably are a little bit more worn, I guess, than the ones at the top. So maybe that's a part of that. Also that, you know, like animals like jackrabbits and mice, they will also eat the tissue at the base of saguaros. I've seen that a couple times where there's a couple little bite marks taken out of them. There might be a couple more that I'm missing, but those are the ones that I can think of.
Great, thank you. And Doris also mentioned, yeah, pack rats can cause damage.
Yeah, yes.
Okay, David is asking, how can we get the Department of Agriculture to enforce the law? David, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask, give us a little bit more about that, what you're referring to? David, are you around? Do you want to expound a little bit on your question, either in the chat or in person? In person.
As in person as it is in this climate, I think.
All right, we'll come back to it. If anybody else has a question, please feel free to ask. You can ask in the chat or go ahead and directly unmute yourself at this point and go ahead and ask. Margaret, do you have a question? Anybody have a question?
Yeah, hi, this is Thomas Stout.
Hi, yeah, sure. What's your question?
Okay, so I work with conservation with the Tucson Cactus and Succulent Society, and I've talked with you guys a little bit about your project, and we're trying to do some of the same things. You guys got the jump on us and got all those young saguaros from box before we had a chance to get to them. So good luck with those. They're precious little items. So I just looking at the one photo of the planting that you did, thinking about saguaro young ones where they're growing, and of course under nurse trees is definitely a big thing. They grow in a lot of litter and debris. And are you packing a lot of litter debris around them as well when you're doing that? Or if you're not, that's a good suggestion for you to do.
Yeah, that's an excellent comment. Yeah, the ones that I didn't show, the ones that I showed in the picture didn't have them, but many of the ones that we do have, we do put like little sticks or rocks around them just to provide an extra layer of protection. So yeah, that's a great comment. Thank you.
Yeah, great. And are you, I know there's been some discussion about protecting them a little more with cages. Is that in your thought processes at all, or is that just something that's you're going to put out there and hope they survive?
Yeah, that's a good question. We haven't talked too much about that, but yeah, that's a good suggestion. I'm gonna start thinking about that a little more.
Yeah, I know it's a costly item, but you know, at Mason Center, maybe you could try a few of them and test it and see how they work out. When we get around to it with the Cactus Society, I think we're going to try to. My suggestion is that we try to cage almost all of our plants for the first couple of years while they get a little chance to get established.
Okay, yeah, that's definitely good to know. I know we've been kind of interested in kind of doing some experimental stuff and seeing how they would survive based on like having different characteristics applied to them. So like maybe caging would be an interesting thing to add to that. So yeah, definitely agree.
Yeah, and I've heard a lot of this stuff that you're doing, and it sounds pretty good. So certainly good luck with that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas. All right, we have a question from Lisa. I don't know if you know this, Aya, but Lisa's wondering if the saguaros on golf courses suffer from golf balls getting lodged in them. That's such a fun question, Lisa. I mean, not fun, but I would never have thought of that.
Yeah, wow, what an interesting question. Oh, wow. I don't know about that. I've never thought about that. I'm assuming that they won't be hitting them hard enough to puncture the ribs, hopefully, unless they're like a super golfer, or golfing is a more intense sport than I thought. Yeah, one of the things that really damages saguaros is damaging the ribs within them. It kind of damages how they are able to cycle water within the saguaro. So hopefully if that process isn't impacted, it won't have a huge impact on them, but
most of the time, this is Lisa. Most of the time the golf balls are completely inside the cacti.
Wow.
They are just, yeah,
they're embedded.
They're embedded.
That's interesting.
And we've also several times going out toward Mount Ord, we have witnessed peoples with guns shooting at the saguaros. They shoot them.
That I've seen impacts. I've seen that before for sure, and that likely does damage them pretty bad, because I'm sure that would damage the ribs. Wow, if the golf balls are embedded, then yeah, I'm sure that's definitely doing something bad to it. Yeah, that's an excellent comment. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Lisa. And Doris mentioned that they have photographs of this happening. So Doris, I think Aya and I would love to see some of those. You are a wonderful and prolific photographer, Doris, and I appreciate seeing all of your photos always. So that would be great, just out of curiosity. Thanks for bringing that up. All right, any other questions that we have? Okay, we have a question from Elsie. Why do saguaros on residential lots seem to grow faster than in the wild? Interesting. Okay, so they have a saguaro that is 25 feet tall and was planted 22 years ago and was 4 feet at that time. Okay, great question, Elsie.
That is a good question. I know that depending on the amount of water the saguaros receive, they can grow at different rates. So maybe if it's an area where water is able to accumulate more, maybe that would be impacting the growth rate. But I'm not sure on residential lots specifically, but I think that's the amount of info.
I have another thought too. I have another guess. Please take this with a grain of salt, but I know that saguaros, as they get older, grow more quickly. The rate of growth speeds up. So if you're starting already with a 4-foot cactus, then the rate of growth will be much faster. It took a long time to get to the 4 feet, but the 4 to 25 will take less time than that initial growth period. So my guess is that residential areas are simply purchasing more mature cacti to begin with.
Yeah, That's an excellent thought. Yeah, thank you for adding that.
Okay, so sorry, Tracy has one more question. Let's see. Are saguaro growth rates even in the wild? So, oh, I see. Are you saying like, do they grow at the same rate throughout their lifespan, Tracy?
Right, and you answered that question with your comment. So, yeah.
Got it. Okay. Wonderful. Oh, interesting. Mary commented that some acquaintances of theirs gave their new saguaros Miracle-Gro and they grew fast but looked strange. It's a really interesting experiment. I'm curious to know what they did with that.
Very cool. I know one of the things that we're thinking about doing for saguaros is also dusting the roots with a little sulfur. So that's another thing that we're interested in kind of trying out as well.
All right. Any other questions?
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Oh, this is Dave Berry. I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with Zoom. But I've had a problem where I've had a bunch of saguaros needlessly smashed, and I've gone to the Department of Agriculture and asked for some protection on this. And the enforcement officer says that he can't get any convictions, that basically it's impossible to get a judge to take this seriously or something. Is there anything that as a group we can get more attention to the laws that are already on the books? There's very strong laws that protect these saguaros, but if you can't enforce those laws, then they're no good.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. That sounds super frustrating. I'm sorry that people are destroying saguaros and that you have to deal with that. You know, I'm not super familiar with the policy. I don't know if Thomas, since you're from the Cactus and Succulent Society, you know anything about that. But yeah, I'm not super familiar with the policy side of it.
Yeah, Thomas, I like you, I'm not all that familiar. There, you know, as David pointed out, there are regulations. I think it's the problem is catching somebody in the act and then prosecuting them. If they see someone doing damage, they can prosecute them, but otherwise it's a really difficult process to track down. It would probably be extremely expensive. And like most organizations, they have limited funds, so they're probably not gonna, unfortunately, they're not gonna look into that kind of thing.
Yeah, thank you for that, Thomas. And I just want to add, I will share the email address of our conservation advocate. But as Thomas mentioned, in terms of issues like this, as you can imagine, there are many, and our advocacy department is only 2 people. So we are also strained as well. I would recommend, David, that local law enforcement might be slightly more responsive than the Department of Agriculture. But unfortunately, other than working with law enforcement, I'm not sure that there is a good answer to that question. But I feel your pain, and that is very frustrating.
Well, I've asked the local police to be involved, and they say that's up to the Department of Agriculture. There's a enforcement officer, his name is Manny Angulo, but he's basically saying that he can't get anybody prosecuted, even if people have photographs of him doing it, because it's not taken very seriously.
I'm very sorry about that, David. Yeah, that's one of the really unfortunate issues with working in conservation, and I'm sorry that you're experiencing that. All right. Tracy. Tracy is asking, do we know how many saguaros have been lost to development? Are there estimates about that, Aya, that you're aware of?
I haven't seen any estimates about that. I think that would be really hard to quantify, right? Because like we've heard, rules are in place. People don't follow the rules, but they're probably not going to write down like, I'm not following the rules. So like we can't, I don't know if there's really a way to estimate that, but you know, I would assume it would be quite a bit, but yeah. It would be great to have those numbers though.
Well, one thing I've noticed, this is Tracy, there's a lot of development going on around Saguaro and north. And currently you can photograph or see the saguaros. What I'm worried about is that pretty soon we won't be seeing them because we'll be seeing a lot more development. And so what I'm wondering is if there's a way to photograph or to get a photographic history of what's going on there and take a look at the laws that are in place to protect them. I know developers will get around the laws whenever they can, but I mean, that would be one thing that would, you know, to get them on the record, at least the saguaros on the record, they're there, and you know, how many but we stand to lose.
I think it's a really good point, developed. Tracy. And I think it's another really, all of these questions are just really highlight how important conservation advocacy is in general. And how important it is to talk to local representatives and talk to your local government officials about these kinds of issues and these kinds of things, who have the enforcement power. And I think that these are all really wonderful points. And I'm so glad that everybody here is so, what's the word? Excited and jazzed and joining Team Conservation. It's very exciting.
Yeah, Thomas here again. Yeah, I agree fully with that. One of the things, first, I don't support any of these developments, and I wish they would all just go away. But many over the years working with the Cactus Society, and we run a rescue program, and we'll go to sites that are going to be developed, and then we have permits with the state, and they allow us to collect saguaros, hedgehogs, barrel cactus, other plants, and for a fee that goes to the state. And then we will try to rehome these into yards. Generally, most of these don't go back into natural areas, but they do stay alive. But what's happening with a lot of developers over the years since we've worked with them, many of them now are setting aside the smaller saguaros, and they'll try to replant them in those areas. Now, it's not the best solution, but it's at least some of the plants are surviving and staying in some of those areas. I think making a strong statement about those particular areas on the way south towards Green Valley, there are a massive number of saguaros there, and I look at that when I drive down there, and I'm always afraid too that they're all going to be lost due to development. Maybe there are ways to publicize that, and we need to work with that.
Thank you so much, Thomas. And I'm so appreciative of everyone's comments and thoughts and feelings about this. Again, I will share our conservation advocate's email address. He is the best person to discuss some of these issues with, especially with our Conservation Action Committee. I will warn everyone, he's also our interim executive director. So right now he is a busy person, but I will go ahead and share that with everyone. And unless there are any more questions, I think we're gonna wrap it up for today. So anything else quick about saguaros? Oh, and I will also share some information about the Cactus and Succulent Society so that you all can learn. They're a wonderful organization, and we have some wonderful volunteers who volunteer with you all as well. All right, well, thank you all so much for coming. We're so appreciative of all of your questions and passion and thoughts and support in general. I will send out a follow-up email, and we'd love to see you all again. So thank you all so much. I hope you have a good afternoon, and feel free to unmute yourself to say goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.